but it kind of stayed with me, this idea that actually we have to learn how to bring what hurts before God. And as I started looking more at scripture, and the scripture is full of laments, full of people saying, God, where are you? This hurts, help me. And yet in our churches we don't hear that very often. We hear lots of language of victory and overcoming, but much less about the God who is present even when our situations don't necessarily change. And so I began to think about this kind of lament and how we needed it in our churches, especially from my perspective, for those who are living with mental illness. And I kind of got this sense as I was reading scripture and kind of doing other reading, that there's this real rhythm throughout scripture and throughout the church year that kind of Anglicans use, but that anyone that we see, that but for each period of celebration there's a real period of preparation. We have Advent, which is this season of waiting in the dark for the new life to begin. We have Christmas, which is obviously a time of celebration, but actually that celebration being linked to Thanksgiving. Lent, and being able to kind of lament. We've got periods of ordinary time, which I look at. The first is on grieving and exploring Nehemiah, and then looking at Philippians in the second, and then obviously looking at Easter as well. And just that sense of that rhythm of kind of preparation before celebration, I think, that I saw, and seeing that actually scripture shows us how to lament if we listen to it.
It's true what you say, because as a worship leader, I've often found that it's hard to find lament songs, even though the Bible's got, as you said, full of lament, and in the Psalms as well. Psalms are really good, actually, to read it, and you can lament along with the psalmist. Yeah, but in terms of the church's worship repertoire as well, I think that is a genre, if you can call it that, that's missing. I do wonder why we like to focus on victory and celebration. And I also wonder if it's something cultural. I know in the Chinese culture, there's this thing called like swallowing our suffering. So we tend to like keep our head down, and if we suffer, then we keep quiet about it. And you say, oh, everything's fine. Even if behind closed doors, things are not going well. And I don't know, it could be something to do with like shame and honor culture and saving face. But I was just wondering, have you come across in your research and in your writing anything to do with lament, especially across cultures, or this kind of dynamic?
It's been really interesting, actually, because one of the people I read a lot of her writing was Professor Kate Bowler, who writes about, she did her PhD looking at the prosperity gospel, particularly focused in the States, but actually it was really relevant, I think, over here as well, and how we've kind of got caught up in this idea that in order for it to be good news, it has to be happy news. And actually the gospel isn't necessarily happy news. The gospel of Jesus telling us to, lay down our lives for our friends and walk the narrow path isn't necessarily happy news, but it's still good news. And I think that the prosperity gospel is quite tightly, I guess, wrapped around our culture in England. And I think we see these kind of really subtle ideas that, if our suffering isn't ending, then it's because we're not praying hard enough, or we don't have enough faith. And I also think that kind of, traditional British stiff upper lip is quite similar, I guess, to what you're saying about Chinese culture, and that actually it's that sense that we shouldn't share what hurts. We should keep that a private thing. And certainly I know that in the Asian kind of culture, my family in Sri Lanka, it is a very private thing to grieve and to go through difficult times. And I found it really, when I was looking into how different cultures grieve in the book, it was really interesting that actually there's been such a shift. I think we kind of 100, 200 years ago, people died so often that no one could escape it. There was no, it was much more of a part of our everyday life, because it happened so frequently of all ages, because diseases weren't preventable in the same way. The Celtics have a practice called keening, which is kind of a wailing. Queen Victoria wore black after the death of her husband Albert, until her own death. And that sense that we need to kind of have those periods of mourning. Our Jewish friends will sit Shiva. They'll kind of have this period of mourning for 7 days after somebody dies, and yet we have kind of lost all sense of that, because we're constantly striving for to fix everything. And actually, if you're always looking for a fix, you're not going to stop to grieve. And I think that actually it is really important that we learn to grieve, because not everything is fixed in this fallen world we live in. It's not, there is death, there is sadness, there is disappointment, but there is still God's goodness in the midst of all of that. And I think actually we can learn from one another. There's, some cultures are really good, I guess, at taking the space and the time to grieve, but also noticing that we have to re-enter life. And so grieving doesn't mean we just stay shut away forever and ever and ever. But it's just having this space to say, I still miss them, and life still hurts. It's not the same as it was. Excuse me.
Bless you.
I read a really interesting quote about grief, that it isn't that as life goes on, grief doesn't get smaller, life gets bigger around it. So the grief kind of stays the same. Whether you've lost a loved one or you're going through, you are living with a chronic condition, the pain of that doesn't necessarily fade or get smaller, but hopefully life gets bigger around it.
Yeah.
I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about it, and a helpful way that we can bring it to God, that actually, yes, God is in the life that is big, that grows bigger, but he's also in the pain that kind of will emerge from time to time.